Ezra chapter 2. Leaders of the return. Here is a list of the people of the province who had been exiled, carried off to Babel by Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel, but who later returned from exile and went up to Jerusalem and Yehuda, each to his own city. They went with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispah, Bigvai, Recham and Baana, the number of men from the people of Israel. The people. Descendants of Parosh, 2,172. Descendants of Shphatya, 372. Descendants of Arak, 775. Descendants of Pachat Moav, from the descendants of Yeshua and Yoav, 2,812. Descendants of Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Zartu, 945. Descendants of Zakkai, 760. Descendants of Bani, 642. Descendants of Bevi, 623. Descendants of Azgad, 1,222. Descendants of Adonikam, 666. Descendants of Bigvai, 2,056. Descendants of Adin, 454. Descendants of Atta, of Yechizkiah, 98. Descendants of Betzai, 323. Descendants of Yorah, 112. Descendants of Hashem, 223. Descendants of Gibbah, 95. Descendants of Beit Lechem, 123. People of Intufa, 56. People of Anatot, 128. Descendants of Asmavet, 42. Descendants of Kiriat, Aram, Kaphira and Beero, 743. Descendants of Ramah and Geva, 621. People of Michmas, 122. People of Beit El and Ai, 223. Descendants of Nevo, 52. Descendants of Magbish, 156. Descendants of the other, Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Haram, 320. Descendants of Lod, Hadid and Ono, 725. Descendants of Jericho, 345. Descendants of Senah, 3,630. The priests. The Kohanim. Descendants of Yedaiah, of the house of Yeshua, 973. Descendants of Immer, 1,052. Descendants of Pashachur, 1,247. Descendants of Haram, 1,017. The Levites. The Leviim, descendants of Yeshua and Kadmiel, of the descendants of Hodaviah, 74. The singers, descendants of Asaph, 128. The descendants of the gatekeepers, descendants of Shallum, descendants of Atta, descendants of Talmon, descendants of Akav, descendants of Hatita, and descendants of Shavai, in all, 139. The Nethinims. The temple servants, descendants of Sitcha, descendants of Hasupha, descendants of Tabao. Descendants of Keros, descendants of Sha'ar, descendants of Paddan. Descendants of Lavana, descendants of Hagava, descendants of Akav. descendants of Haggith, descendants of Salmai, descendants of Hanan, descendants of Giddel, descendants of Gachar, descendants of Reaiah, descendants of Retzin, descendants of Enkoda, descendants of Gazan, descendants of Uzzah, descendants of Pashik, descendants of Basiah, descendants of Asna, descendants of Meonim, descendants of Infusim, descendants of Bakbuk, descendants of Hakupha, descendants of Harha, descendants of Batslut, descendants of Machida, descendants of Harsha, descendants of Barkos, descendants of Sisra, descendants of Temech, descendants of Intziach, and descendants of Hatipha, the descendants of Shlomo's servants, descendants of Satai, descendants of Hassophareh, descendants of Pruda, descendants of Yala, descendants of Darkon, descendants of Giddel, descendants of Shphatya, descendants of Hattil, descendants of Pokereh Hatzvaim, and descendants of Ami. All the temple's servants and the descendants of Shlomo's servants numbered 392. The people. The following went up from Telephone Melech, Telephone Harsha, Kerav, Adan and Immer, but they could not state which father's clan they or their children belonged to, so it was not clear whether they were from Israel. Descendants of Delaiah, descendants of Taviah, and descendants of Enkoda, 652. The priests. And of the descendants of the Kohanim, descendants of Haviah, descendants of Hakots, and descendants of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadi and was named after them. These tried to locate their genealogical records, but they weren't found. Therefore they were considered defiled and were not allowed to serve as Kohanim. The Tirshatha told them not to eat any of the especially holy food until a Kohen appeared who could consult the Urim and Thummim. The whole congregation. The entire assembly numbered 42,360. Not including their male and female slaves, of whom there were 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers. Their horses numbered 736, their mules, 245. Their camels, 435, and the donkeys, 6,720. Gifts the people gave. Some of the heads of fathers' clans, when they came to the house of Adonai in Yerushalayim, made voluntary offerings for rebuilding the house of God on its site. According to their means they gave into the treasury for the work 61,000 gold darkmonim, about 2/3 of a ton, 5,000 manim of silver, just over 3 tons, and 100 tunics for the Kohanim. So the Kohanim, the Leviim, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers and the temple servants lived in their towns and all Israel in their towns.